The desert doesn't forget what it buries, it just waits for the right night to whisper it back. Ethan Cole felt the whisper in the grit of the wind against the sun-cracked window of his Ford Falcon. It was a sound like dry bones scraping together, a prelude to a confession. He'd been driving for 3 days, chasing the horizon until the cities bled into towns, then into gas stations, then into nothing but shimmering asphalt and the indifferent glare of the Arizona sky. He was aiming for the empty heart of the map, a place where his own ghosts might finally get lost. The Red Motel was less a building and more a scar on the landscape. Its sign, a flickering crimson cursive R in a dead hotel, was a stuttering beacon in the bruised twilight. The paint on the stucco walls had surrendered to the sun, peeling back to reveal a pale, leprous undercoat. A dozen rooms faced a courtyard of baked earth and skeletal mesquite trees. It was perfect. A tomb with a vacancy sign. He killed the engine, the silence rushing in to fill the void. For a moment he just sat there, the steering wheel hot and sticky beneath his hands, the faint, sour smell of whiskey on his breath. He was a man made of frayed edges and hollow spaces, a former FBI profiler who'd profiled his own soul and found it wanting. A woman emerged from the office, wiping her hands on a grease-stained rag. She moved with a languid, weary grace that seemed born of the heat. Her dark hair was tied back, and her face, though etched with a fine latticework of sunlines, held a stillness that was both unsettling and magnetic. Looking for a room? Her voice was low, raspy, like gravel rolling in a dry creek bed. Ethan nodded, his own voice a stranger in his throat. Just for a while. A while is all we get out here, she said, her eyes the color of storm clouds, scanning the length of his car, his rumpled clothes, the unshaven hollows of his cheeks. It wasn't a judgment, just an inventory. I'm Mara Quinn. I own the place. Ethan. He didn't offer a last name. It didn't belong here. She led him to room 7. The key was actual brass, heavy and cool in his palm. The room smelled of stale cigarettes, dust, and something vaguely metallic like old blood. A single bed with a faded quilt, a wobbly table, and a Gideon's Bible with its spine broken. The air conditioner in the window rattled like a dying man's last breath, churning out air that was only marginally cooler than the inferno outside. Ice machines busted. Water from the tap runs brown for a minute, then clears up, mostly. Mara stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the dying light. Lock your door. Not much out here, but what is, you don't want it finding you. He met her gaze. Sometimes you want to be found. A flicker of something, recognition, pity, maybe just a shared understanding of broken things, passed through her eyes. Be careful what you wish for, Ethan. She left, pulling the office door shut behind her. The click of the lock echoed in the vast, empty quiet. Ethan dropped his duffel bag on the floor, the glass bottle inside clinking softly. He sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning in protest, and stared at the water stains on the ceiling. They looked like maps of countries that had never existed, places with no borders and no names, places a man could disappear. He had come here to bury himself, to let the sun and the silence bake the memories out of his bones. He was thinking of the girl in Philadelphia, the one whose file he still saw when he closed his eyes. The botched raid, the explosion, the face of his partner Julian dissolving in a flash of white-hot light. Guilt was a physical thing, a constant, low-grade fever that spiked in the dark. He spent 3 days in a state of suspended animation. He drank whiskey until the edges of the world blurred, slept when consciousness became too heavy a burden, and sat on the rusted chair outside his room, watching the heat warp the air over the highway. Mara would leave a cup of black coffee and a stale piece of toast on his table in the morning, never saying a word. They were 2 solitary planets orbiting a dead star, their silence a form of communion. On the 4th night, the desert decided to talk. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a scream. The sound tore through the thin fabric of Ethan's drunken sleep. It was high and ragged, choked off almost as soon as it began. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, the instincts he'd tried to drown roaring back to life. He grabbed the heavy mag light from his bag and threw open the door. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky. Mara was already out, standing by the dead ice machine, her form rigid. She was looking past the motel, out towards the sprawling, shadow-choked expanse of the desert floor. "Did you hear that?" Her voice was tight. "I did. He followed her gaze. His eyes, trained to find patterns in chaos, swept the darkness. Nothing. Just the rustle of a tumbleweed, the distant cry of a coyote. But the silence that followed the scream was different. It was heavier, expectant. They found her 50 yards behind the motel, near a cluster of jagged red rocks that looked like broken teeth. The beam of Ethan's flashlight cut a stark white path through the dark, landing first on a pale, bare foot, then a leg, then the impossible, theatrical arrangement of the body. She was young, her hair fanned out like a dark halo in the sand. She was dressed in a simple white dress, now stained with a single, precise wound in her chest. Her arms were crossed over her stomach, and in her hands, she clutched a dead raven, its black feathers a stark contrast to her waxy skin. Her eyes were open, staring up at the star-dusted sky with a look of serene surprise. The blood drained from Ethan's face. The whiskey in his gut turned to acid, his breath hitched. It wasn't just a murder, it was a message, a tableau, an echo. Flashback, Baltimore, 2018. The smell of rain-soaked concrete and decay. He and Julian stood over a similar body in a derelict warehouse. The same white dress, the same single clean wound, the same placid expression. The only difference was the offering. Not a raven, but a porcelain doll, its face cracked. "He's an artist, this one," Julian had said, his voice a low hum of admiration that always unsettled Ethan. Julian Vance was brilliant, sharp, and utterly devoid of the empathy that Ethan believed was essential to their work. He saw killers not as monsters, but as complex puzzles to be solved, and he didn't care what pieces he had to break to solve them. He's a psychopath, Jules. Psychopathy is just a tool. He's using it to build something, a monument to his own pain. Julian had crouched down, his gaze intense. "Look at the hands." He cleaned her nails, posed her fingers just so. "This is about control, about recreating a purity that was stolen from him." They called him the doll maker. He killed 3 women, staging them with meticulous, ritualistic care. And then he vanished. The case went cold, a permanent stain on Ethan's otherwise stellar record. It was the first of his great failures. Back in the Arizona desert, the world tilted on its axis. The raven's beady eye seemed to stare right at him. This wasn't a copycat. The details were too precise, too intimate. The way the victim's chin was tilted at a specific angle, a slight, almost imperceptible detail only he and Julian had noted in the original file. Mara let out a shuddering breath beside him. God, who would do this? Ethan didn't answer. He was looking past the body into the oppressive darkness of the desert. This wasn't random. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a signature, and it was addressed to him. The wail of sirens grew from a distant whine to a piercing shriek, red and blue lights painting the motel and the surrounding desert in frantic, strobing colors. Detective Ruben Alvarez was the first one through the crime scene tape. He was a compact man with a weathered face, a neatly trimmed mustache, and eyes that had seen too much of the sun and the bad things that happen under it. He moved with the unhurried authority of a man who owned his territory. He took one look at Ethan, the haunted expression, the way he stood just outside the perimeter, observing, analyzing, and his professional courtesy evaporated. "Who are you?" Alvarez's voice was flat, all business. "He's a guest," Mara supplied, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off a chill the desert night didn't possess. "Room 7. His name is Ethan." Alvarez's gaze lingered on Ethan. "You find the body?" "We both heard the scream," Ethan said, his voice carefully neutral. He knew the dance. He was the outsider, the transient, the immediate person of interest. "Stay put, both of you." Alvarez turned his attention to the scene, his instructions to the uniformed officers crisp and efficient. He crouched by the body, his face grim, his focus absolute. Ethan watched him work, a phantom limb of his old life aching. He saw the details Alvarez was noting, the lack of defensive wounds, the undisturbed sand around the body, suggesting she was killed elsewhere and placed here, the theatricality of it all. This wasn't your typical desert meth head murder. An hour later, as the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly light across the eastern horizon, Alvarez approached him again. A deputy stood a few feet away, a silent threat. "Okay, Ethan from room 7. Let's talk." He pulled out a small notebook. Full name, Ethan Cole. Alvarez's pen stopped. He looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing. He held Ethan's gaze for a long beat, then snapped his notebook shut. "Wait here." He walked over to his cruiser and spoke into his radio. A few minutes later, he returned, his expression now a mask of undisguised suspicion. Ethan Cole, formerly of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Behavioral Analysis Unit, took an indefinite leave of absence 18 months ago after a botched operation in Philadelphia. Am I getting that right? You've been busy, Ethan said dryly. A dead girl staged like a piece of art shows up a stone's throw from a retired FBI profiler's motel room? Yeah, I get busy. Alvarez stepped closer, his voice dropping. So let me ask you, Mr. Cole, what are the odds? I don't know. You tell me. I'll tell you what I think. I think you're either the unluckiest son of a bitch in Arizona, or you brought your ghosts with you. His eyes were hard as agate. This kind of thing doesn't happen in my county. People kill each other over water rights, drug debts, women. They use shotguns and tire irons. They don't leave them out for display with a fucking bird in their hands. The case was called the Dollmaker, Ethan heard himself say, the words tasting like ash. Baltimore, 2018. The killer was never caught. Alvarez's jaw tightened. You think this is him? No, Ethan said, the certainty of it chilling him to the bone. I think this is someone who knows about him. Someone who knows about me. Stay out of my investigation, Cole, Alvarez warned, his voice a low growl. You're not a Fed anymore. You're a person of interest. You so much as sneeze in the wrong direction, and I'll have you in a cell so fast your head will spin. You understand me? Ethan just stared back at him, the desert wind kicking up dust around their feet. He understood perfectly. He was a fly caught in a web he'd thought he'd left behind, and the spider was starting to pull on the strands. He couldn't stay out of it. He and Alvarez both knew it. The killer had come here for him. To ignore that would be to let another person die. The guilt from Philadelphia was a raw, open wound. He couldn't bear to carve another one next to it. He spent the next 2 days in a self-imposed prison, watching the deputies come and go, watching Alvarez direct his team with quiet competence. He sobered up, the clarity painful. The whiskey had been a comfortable fog, but now he needed to see. He started with Mara. He found her in the office, staring at a ledger book, but not seeing it. The motel was a ghost town, cordoned off by yellow tape. Did you know her? Ethan asked, leaning against the doorframe. Mara looked up, her eyes shadowed. Her name was Sarah, drove a beat-up Toyota, paid cash for a week, said she was heading to California to be a star. She gave a bitter, humorless laugh. Another one. Did she talk to anyone? See anyone? People come here to be alone, Ethan. We don't do mixers. Her gaze was sharp, probing. That detective, he thinks you have something to do with this. He's right, Ethan said. Mara's hands stilled on the ledger. What does that mean? It means this isn't about her. You said it's about me. He watched her face for a reaction, a flicker of deceit, but found only a deep, resonant wariness. Everyone's running from something, she said softly. I guess yours finally caught up. The conversation felt like a dead end, but it planted a seed of doubt. Her calm was unnatural. Or maybe, he thought, she was just as broken as he was, and the world had lost its ability to shock her. The break came 3 days later, a second body. This one was 100 miles east, a male transient found nailed to the weathered wood of an abandoned roadside chapel. He was positioned in a posture of prayer, his hands clasped together. A Bible lay open on the ground before him, turned to a passage from the book of Job. Alvarez didn't have to call Ethan. The details hit the state newswire, and Ethan felt it like a punch to the gut. The Penitent Preacher Case, Houston, 2019. A serial killer who targeted homeless men, believing he was cleansing them of their sins. Another one of Ethan's failures. The killer had committed suicide before he could be apprehended, leaving a litany of unanswered questions and a string of tormented families. But again, the detail. The passage from Job was the same one the original killer had underlined in a Bible found in his apartment, a piece of evidence that had never been released to the public. Only a handful of agents on the task force knew about it. And Julian had been the one to find it. Flashback, Houston, 2019. Julian held the evidence bag with the Bible in it, a thin, predatory smile on his face. See, Ethan, he's not just killing them, he's absolving them. He thinks he's God. He's a delusional narcissist, Ethan countered, rubbing his temples. The case had been going on for weeks, the Texas heat oppressive. Tomato, Julian had scoffed. We get inside his delusion, we find him. You want to understand his pain. I want to use it like a key to open his skull. We need to think like him, be crueler than him. That's not how it works, Jules. It's exactly how it works, Julian had hissed, his eyes glinting. You're just too afraid to get your hands dirty. The memory faded, leaving a cold dread in its wake. This wasn't just someone who knew the files. This was someone who knew his arguments with Julian, his philosophies, his every professional weakness. That night, the phone in his room rang. The sound was so alien it made him jolt. It was an old rotary phone, a relic, and it hadn't made a sound since he'd arrived. He stared at it, his heart hammering against his ribs. It rang again, a shrill, demanding peal that sliced through the silence. Slowly, he lifted the receiver. Hello? Static, and then a voice, electronically distorted, low and menacing. A digital rasp. You always miss what's right in front of you, Ethan. Click. The line went dead. He slammed the phone down, his hand trembling. It was a direct quote, something Julian had said to him a dozen times in frustration. It was a taunt, a clue, and a death sentence. The killer wasn't just recreating the crimes, he was recreating the investigations, the very texture of Ethan's past. His paranoia, a sleeping beast, was now wide awake and ravenous. He looked out his window at the motel office where a single light burned. Mara. She was always there, always watching, the stoic observer. What did she know? Was her weary resignation a front? People come here to be alone or to wait? He needed to know. Acting on an impulse born of fear and desperation, he waited until her light went out, then slipped out of his room. The lock on the office door was old and flimsy. It took him less than 30 seconds with a credit card. Inside, the office smelled of her, faintly of cigarettes, coffee, and desert dust. He moved his maglite beam across the cluttered desk, the overflowing ashtray, the dog-eared paperbacks. He went for the filing cabinet. It was unlocked. Inside were receipts, tax forms, employee records for a cleaning lady who came once a month. In the very back, under a folder labeled Warranties, his fingers brushed against a slim manila envelope. It felt different, heavier. He pulled it out. There was no label. Inside was a single 8x10 glossy photograph. It was a surveillance photo, grainy and dark, but the subject was unmistakable. A younger Mara Quinn sitting on a park bench, talking to a man. The man's face was in shadow, but his build, his posture, it was familiar. Ethan's blood ran cold when he saw the man's hand resting on the back of the bench. On his pinky finger was a silver ring with distinctive onyx stone. Julian's ring, the one he never took off. A wave of vertigo washed over Ethan. Mara wasn't a random motel owner. She was connected. She was part of it. He felt a surge of white-hot fury, the sting of betrayal. He'd been played. The Red Motel wasn't a refuge, it was a stage, and he was the lead actor in a play he didn't know he was in. He strode out of the office and hammered on her door, the one attached to the back of the building marked Manager. She opened it after a moment, dressed in a thin robe, her face etched with alarm that quickly hardened into defiance when she saw the photograph in his hand. "What is this, Mara?" he demanded, his voice a raw whisper. "Who are you?" Her shoulders slumped in defeat. "You'd better come in." Her apartment was as sparse as the motel rooms, but cleaner. She lit a cigarette, her hands shaking slightly. "My sister," she began, her voice barely audible. She was the first dollmaker victim. The one they found before they even knew they had a serial killer on their hands. Her case was never linked, never solved. Ethan stared at her, his mind reeling. The FBI closed the book on it, but I didn't. I kept digging. I found things. A year ago, some men from Internal Affairs came to see me. They told me they had reason to believe the agent who botched the investigation into my sister's death was still active, covering his tracks. They said his name was Julian Vance, and they said he wasn't dead. The floor dropped out from under him. "Julian is alive?" "They believe he faked his death in that explosion in Philadelphia," Mara continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by years of suppressed grief and anger. "They think he's been operating in the shadows ever since. They knew he had an obsession with you, your partnership, your rivalry. They said if anyone could draw him out, it was you. So they set this up. They bought this motel under a shell corporation, put me here to run it, and leaked your location, knowing you were looking for a place to disappear. They were using me as bait. And you were the lure." Betrayal was too small a word. He was a pawn in a shadow war he never knew was being fought. The FBI, his own agency, had hung him out to dry, manipulating his guilt and trauma to hunt one of their own. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was hollow. They told me you were unstable, a drunk, that if you knew you'd spook him, she said, tears welling in her eyes. I just wanted justice for my sister. I didn't know he'd start killing again. I never wanted this. A sudden, terrifying clarity washed over Ethan. The final case, the one that had broken him, the Philadelphia raid, it was the only one left. Julian wasn't just replaying their greatest failures, he was building to a grand finale. He was coming for the one that mattered most, the one that supposedly killed him. Flashback, Philadelphia, 2020. Gunfire and shouting, the stench of cordite and fear. They were raiding the row house of a violent gun runner. Intelligence was solid, or so they said. Ethan took the front, Julian the back. It was supposed to be a simple in and out, but the intel was wrong. The house was rigged, a tripwire. An explosion tore through the back of the house just as Julian's team went in. A secondary blast rocked the foundations. Fire, screaming. Ethan remembered dragging a wounded agent out, the heat searing his face. He remembered the look of horror on the SWAT commander's face. He remembered seeing the body bag, zip tight, being loaded into the ambulance. Julian Vance, they said. Gone. And worse, a 10-year-old girl, the gun runner's daughter who wasn't supposed to be there, was caught in the collapse. Her death was laid squarely at the feet of the FBI, at the feet of the agent in charge of the op, at Ethan's feet. The guilt had been an anchor, pulling him down into the dark ever since. The thought that Julian hadn't died, but had somehow orchestrated it, it was unthinkable. And yet, it made a terrible kind of sense. The phone in his room started ringing again. He looked at Mara, her face pale in the dim light. He knew who it was. And he knew the call wasn't for a conversation. It was a summons. He ran back to his room and snatched up the receiver. The distorted voice was gone. This was pure, unadulterated Julian, his voice laced with a triumphant, chilling sanity. Hello, partner, surprised? Jules, why? Why? Because you were weak, Ethan. Your obsession with why they did it, your bleeding heart empathy, you let them win. The doll maker, the preacher, they're still out there in spirit because you never had the stomach to finish the job. I'm just providing a little closure for you, for their victims. You're insane. No, I'm liberated. That fire in Philly, it burned away all the bullshit, all the rules and regulations you loved so much. It set me free. It showed me the truth you were always too afraid to see. To catch a monster, you have to be the bigger monster. And now, it's time for the final act, your greatest failure. The one that made you who you are today. Come to the old Mission Church off Route 177. It's time for your confession. The line went dead. Ethan stood in the silent room, the pieces of his life clicking into place, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. Julian hadn't been his partner. He'd been his shadow, his dark reflection. And he had been manipulating him for years, curating his guilt, stoking his trauma, all to set the stage for this final confrontation. He looked at Mara, who had followed him standing in the doorway. Her expression was a mixture of terror and resolve. Don't go, she pleaded. Call Alvarez. Let the police handle it. He won't talk to them, Ethan said, his voice grim. This is between him and me. It always has been. This wasn't just about stopping a killer anymore. It was about redemption, about facing the man who had authored his pain. He grabbed the maglite and the keys to his car. For the first time in 18 months, he wasn't running from his ghosts. He was driving straight into them. The Mission San Xavier del Desierto was a ruin, its adobe walls crumbling under the relentless assault of time and sun. It stood alone against the blackness, a skeletal monument to a forgotten faith. As Ethan's Falcon crunched to a halt on the gravel, he saw a faint flicker of orange light from within the chapel's broken archway. A single lantern. He stepped out of the car, the desert air cold and sharp. The silence was absolute. I know you're here, Ethan. I can practically smell the self-pity on you. Julian's voice echoed from inside, amplified by the crumbling walls. Ethan entered the chapel. In the center of the nave, Julian Vance stood beside the lantern. The left side of his face was a tapestry of burned scars, the skin pulled taut over his cheekbone, twisting his mouth into a permanent, grotesque smirk. His left eye was milky and blind, but his right eye was the same as Ethan remembered. Intelligent, intense, and utterly merciless. It's good to see you, partner, Julian said, his smile widening. You look like hell. They told me you were dead, Jules. Reports were exaggerated, a convenient fiction. It allowed me to work more freely, to become what was necessary. He gestured around the ruined chapel. I chose this place for a reason, a place of judgment. Your judgment, Ethan. He held up a remote detonator, a small black box with a single red button. Just like Philly, a little insurance, but this time, it's not a gunrunner's house, it's the Red Motel, your little sanctuary. Ethan's blood froze. Mara, the righteous pawn, Julian sneered. She's tied up in the office, a fitting sacrifice, don't you think? Another life ruined because of your hesitation. A perfect echo of the little girl in Philadelphia. You see the poetry of it? I'm not a killer, Ethan. I'm an editor. I'm cleaning up your messy narratives, giving them the endings they deserve. Fury, cold and pure, burned through Ethan's fear. This has nothing to do with justice. This is about your ego, your narcissism. This is about proving I was right. Julian roared, his scarred face contorting. You and your rules, your morality, it's a cage. I'm free. I do what needs to be done. He took a step forward, his good eye boring into Ethan. I'm giving you a choice, the kind you love so much. Walk away, get in your car and drive. Disappear, just like you wanted to. I'll let the girl live, but I will continue my work. Or you can try to stop me. And I'll push this button and your little motel and the woman inside will be nothing but a pillar of fire. Your final failure immortalized in flame. It was the ultimate test, his own life versus Mara's, his soul versus his guilt. The profiler in him screamed that Julian was bluffing, that he wouldn't destroy his own stage. But the man who had lived with Julian, who had seen the darkness in him, knew better. There's no walking away, Jules, Ethan said softly. He didn't charge, he didn't yell. He took a single deliberate step forward and kicked the lantern. It shattered against the stone floor, the oil and flame spreading in a hungry whoosh across the dry tinder of fallen timbers and ancient prayer books. Fire erupted, roaring to life, consuming the darkness. Julian staggered back, momentarily blinded, his scarred face illuminated by the inferno. In that split second of surprise, Ethan lunged, not for Julian, but for the detonator. They crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs. The fight was not one of skill, but of desperate, primal rage. Ethan's fists hammered at Julian, but his ex-partner was a man possessed, fueled by years of rage and obsession. Julian's fingers clawed at Ethan's eyes, his teeth snapping like a cornered animal. The fire surged around them, the heat blistering, the smoke thick and acrid. Wooden beams overhead groaned, protesting the sudden, violent heat. You'd sacrifice us both? Julian choked out, a maniacal grin on his face, even as Ethan's forearm pressed against his throat. For her? For your precious redemption? This isn't redemption, Ethan grunted, his lungs burning. It's a course correction. With a final surge of adrenaline, Ethan ripped the detonator from Julian's grasp. But Julian was faster. He twisted, grabbing a loose piece of rebar from the crumbling floor and swinging it in a vicious arc. It caught Ethan in the ribs, the impact stealing his breath and sending a jolt of agony through his body. He fell back, the detonator skittering across the floor. The roof above them gave a final, deafening crack. A massive burning beam began to fall directly towards them. Julian scrambled for the detonator. Ethan, ignoring the fire in his side, launched himself forward. He had one last choice to make. He didn't grab the detonator, he grabbed Julian. He wrapped his arms around his former partner, his dark reflection, and held on tight. Julian screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated hatred as he looked up at the ceiling. I won, Ethan, he shrieked over the roar of the flames. I made you me. The last thing Ethan saw was Julian's one good eye, wide with terror and triumph, before the burning timber crashed down and the world dissolved into fire and pain in a final, merciful silence. The official report was thin. The fire at the Mission San Xavier had been followed by a secondary, more powerful explosion at the Red Motel. Cause unknown. In the ruins of the church, investigators found the remains of one body, burned beyond recognition. Dental records, what few could be recovered, were a partial match for the fugitive, Julian Vance. Special Agent Ethan Cole, on indefinite leave from the FBI, was listed as missing, presumed deceased. The sole survivor, motel owner Mara Quinn, had been found with minor injuries, having escaped the office just before the blast. Her testimony was confused, fragmented by trauma. She spoke of two men, of a fight, of fire. The case was closed. The desert reclaimed its silence. 6 months later, the Red Motel was rebuilt, not with the same weary character, but with the sterile, anonymous efficiency of a modern chain. New sign, new paint, new management. A man pulled up one evening in a nondescript sedan. He was gaunt, his movements stiff, as if his body was still learning how to piece itself together. He wore a baseball cap pulled low and sunglasses, though the sun had long since set. He walked to the counter. The young man behind it barely looked up from his phone. "Room for the night?" the clerk asked. The man nodded. He paid in cash. As he signed the register, the clerk caught a glimpse of his hand. The back of it was a roadmap of scarred, puckered skin. "Here's your key, sir. Room 7. The man took the key. He looked up, and for a second his sunglasses slipped. The clerk saw his eyes. One was clear, a startling shade of blue, filled with a profound and bottomless exhaustion. The other was milky and blind. He went to his room, the same room as before, now clean and impersonal. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, the silence of the room, a living thing. On the bedside table sat a new digital phone. It began to ring, its electronic chime jarring and artificial. It rang once, twice, a third time. He stared at it, a ghost in a room full of echoes. The phone rang again, and this time he answered.